Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a frontline update for February the 20th, 2023. The ISW that I always use for giving me some Russian and Ukrainian voices to try and piece together what's going on. People attack me for using ISW because they say, oh, it's some kind of neocon, X, Y, and Z, ideological, blah, blah, blah. I don't really care because actually it's very useful for just footnoting the sources it uses to say what the claims are for the Russians and the claims are for the Ukrainians. So understanding that I use it in that way says very little about whether I agree with the kind of work it does or whatever in an ideological sense. However, on a Monday, because it's the day after Sunday, they don't do a daily report for the front lines. They just have bullet points, but they've got a really fascinating discussion part at the beginning talking about the constitution of the Russian forces. I just want to briefly talk about this because it's super important. The major phase of the Russian offensives, so they say, offensive operations in Luhansk Oblast is underway. So this is Luhansk Oblast being up here in the northeast. So this is Luhansk. Let me try and draw that on for you for those who can't quite see. Let's bring that over there. And that's going to come down. That's Luhansk, comes down like that. So Luhansk Oblast is to the east of that, and that is what the ISW is talking about here. Oh, let's go back. So Russia likely lacks sufficient uncommitted reserves to dramatically increase the scale or intensity of the offensive this winter. I've been banging on whether I don't know if this is the offensive or not because if it isn't, if it is the offensive, it's really underwhelming. Like, is this all that Russia have got? And if it isn't the offensive, then they're treating their forces in a pre-offensive offensive. What's going on? So neither position looks good for Russia. Okay. But it goes on. The current pattern of commitment in Luhansk Oblast indicates that Russian forces in this area are deploying in doctrinal units and formations from the military district level down to the brigade regiment level at least, and likely down to the battalion level as well. Russian forces operating in and near Luhansk Oblast frontline are drawn almost entirely from the Western Military District, WMD, and a few reinforcements from other force groupings. This disposition suggests that the Russian military command has returned to the traditional military district command and control structure, wherein all units in a discrete geographical area fall under the area of responsibility of a single military district, in this case the WMD. These regiments have been reconstituted with mobilized personnel, indicating that the Russian command is using mobilized soldiers as replacements in doctrinal structures instead of creating ad hoc formations. Russian forces have deployed throughout this war in various non-standard and non-doctrinal structures, starting with the battalion tactical group, but encompassing also volunteer regiments, BARs, the National Combat Reserve units, and militia units belonging to the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, to say nothing of the Wagner private military company. Formations of convicts. The return to doctrinal structures represents an inflection in Russian force structure and campaign design. As ISW has previously assessed, the Russian Ministry of Defense (MOD) is currently engaging in a number of reforms meant to formalize and professionalize the Russian armed forces and prepare to fight a protracted war in Ukraine as a conventional army. The current array of forces along the Luhansk Oblast front line likely reflects an ongoing shift in Russian military procedure towards a Russian MOD establishment. So they've kind of gone back to how they used to do their force constitution and organization prior to the reforms that started sort of a decade plus ago. The Russian military has committed a large majority of the conventional elements belonging to the Western Military District to its decisive offensive effort in Luhansk Oblast, leaving relatively few elements either in reserve or unobserved. So this is pretty huge. That's why I'm talking about this. ISW has not observed the commitment of the 2nd Motor Rifle Division, 2nd MRD, of the 1st Guards Tank Army. So that's a fairly elite tank unit to combat, even though the unit was reported to have deployed to Luhansk Oblast. The absence of several elite and prominent WMD elements from Luhansk Oblast online and elsewhere in theatre suggests that the Russian military continues to face challenges in reconstituting combat units and specifically tank units. And of course, it gives evidence for all of this and footnotes all of these claims. I'm just doing the headline claims. Russian tank losses have been enormous in this war, amounting to the equivalent of around 16 tank regiments worth, which is likely hindering Russia's ability to reconstitute its tank units rapidly. The pattern of Russian deployments in other parts of the theatre strongly suggests that most of the available maneuver elements of the other military districts and the airborne forces are already committed and thus do not constitute a large reserve that Moscow could suddenly hurl into the fray in Luhansk Oblast or elsewhere. There may well be more Russian elements online in Luhansk Oblast that the ISW has observed at this time. There may be more, but it really appears like this is the majority of what they have to offer. And that's absolutely fascinating analysis there. Okay, let's go to Frontline, the northeast. We are going to go to Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna, starting up in Kupiansk. On my map, that looks like this. So the Kupiansk area has seen quite a lot of growing intensity of fighting, particularly around a place called Sinkivka and Hrenikivka just here. So Hrenikivka is now controlled by the Russians, and there's fierce fighting in Sinkivka. No reports are pro-Ukrainian. Source says Kupiansk area remains a bit of a mystery due to lack of information. Fighting has been reported just east of Kotylyarivka. It's a bit further, so east of Kotylyarivka. Russian troops approached the village but were repelled. Around Dvorichna, there is an area unknown, which I think outlined in red is Russian controlled. So this is Dvorichna is there, and there could be. I don't know whether. I don't know whether he's talking about outlined in red, could be Dvorichna. He's actually talking about getting a little bit confused there. And we have, Kotylyarivka, which I'll talk about in a second. So, Andrew Perpetua says of this area, Russia is attacking Sinkivka with increasing intensity, mainly with infantry moving through the forest supported by heavy mortar fire. I expect Russia to maintain, if not increase intensity for the next week plus, with the goal of reaching Kupiansk and the Oskil River. So this is to say that Sinkivka is having, a lot of pressure put on it from the north. They're also pushing to the west from Liman Pershi and towards Dvorichna from this is Hrenikivka, which is now controlled by the Russians. Poulet-Volon's map, which is nice and clear, shows that as well. They are pushing to the Oskil River. So the Oskil River goes all the way down to the south. You've got the Kherson River in the middle as well. Let's show you that on my map. It might be easier to see. So you've got the Oskil River. I'll do that in blue. Oskil River down here, and that goes sort of all the way down to Liman. Then you've got somewhere around here, you've got the Kherson River, which is going to be round about here, somewhere like that. And then you've got the Krasna River that comes down there. So they're going to be pushing past the Kherson River. That's going to be their initial aim. So you've got so it's around here actually, slightly further to the east. So you've got Zarichna, Yampelivka, Terny, all the way up there to Makivka, and then up here to Kovalivka area, and then you've got the Oskil River. So that first of all, they want to attack, the Russians want to attack to the Kherson River and then to Oskil. But further up north at Kupiansk, they're already pretty much at the Oskil River. So if they can breach the Oskil up here in this area, then it gives them the ability to be on the western side of that river already, and they can maybe come down from the north there and try and encircle Kupiansk, which sits pretty much on the river there. Kupiansk here. So Kupiansk will be a difficult nut for them to crack. It's a fairly substantial city, and I'm sure the Ukrainians will have dug in there quite considerably. But yeah, so that's activity going on up in Kupiansk area. The pro-Russian source Rebar seems to have stopped posting on Twitter. It has not done for about 5-6 days now, but it does post on Telegram. And on Telegram, they say really the only thing they mentioned before Bakhmut is up here in Khranikivka, and they say that in Kupiansk sector, Russian troops liberated Khranikivka on the eastern bank of the Oskil River, knocking Ukrainian units out of the settlement. The enemy launched a series of unsuccessful counterattacks in an attempt to retake the settlement, but the servicemen repelled the attack, and that's what the Russians say. So she's popping down south. No report says there's activity to the east of Kotelyrivka, which is where have you gone? On the way down. Oh, I just had it a second ago. Here it is, Kotelyrivka. So there is action to the east of there, but I don't know any other details really. And then not too much detail as far as I know, but around Svatove, between Svatove and Kreminna. Although Andrew Perpetua puts a little bit more detail on the Kislivka claims Russia's heavily shelling the Kislivka-Kotlyarivka area in preparation for future attacks. They sent DRGs, so deep reconnaissance groups, into these towns, and from what I've read, they were destroyed. So it could be that this might be the scene of a future Russian concentration. So just sorry to flip back to there. So that is Kotelyrivka, Kislivka, Ivanivka, Yahidne. So Yahidne was under Ukrainian control about a month or so ago, and they were moving towards Sofivka, and now it seems that Russians have pushed back, and this could be the site of a large offensive for the Russians, but I'm not 100% sure, but they are heavily shelling it at the moment. And then we move down to the Kreminna area. So this is on Poulet-Volon's map, what is happening there. Not a huge amount of change in territory as far as I can work out, although no reports does say that around Kreminna I increased the Russian buffer northwest of the city. Ukrainian troops have repelled an attack towards Yampolivka and from Cheponopivka, which indicates that Russian troops control more land closer to Ukrainian area than previously thought. There is still no breakthrough. So he has a larger area here than he had previously given the Russians credit for controlling. As far as I'm concerned, I have that already pretty much there. So no change as far as I'm concerned in my mapping in the area. Let's see what Andrew Perpetua has to say about Kreminna. So, in the forest south of Kreminna, there are reports from both Russians and Ukrainians that Ukraine either never lost as much ground or previously reported ground as previously reported, or else successfully counterattacked and retook this land. I'm keeping the area marked as grey area, though, so a bit of a grey zone. So he says that this area to the south of Kreminna is actually, so if we go to my map, it might be that the Ukrainians have control of more of this area than had previously been thought, but nonetheless, it's just fierce fighting going on in the forest to the south of Kreminna. So with regard to north of Bakhmut, or Bakhmut in general, we come further down south here to Bakhmut. Not too much news. I'm sure there's fighting going on in Rozdilivka and Fedorivka. In fact, let's go and have a look at Rebar's claims first. So they talk about Paraskevivka, as you can imagine, and Bekivka here. So we're going to move down past Krasnopolivka, past Bladatny and Zalizhnyansky to this E40 or M03 road that comes in and connects to another road at basically Paraskevivka, south of Paraskevivka. Krasnohor, if you remember, and then Paraskevivka were surrounded, and it looks like the Russians are just advancing south in a fairly consistent manner, have crossed the highway in sort of several places. Now, different mappers will say different things. At the moment, Rebar says, after the liberation of Paraskevivka, fighters of Wagner PMC advance in Bakhivka through which several important routes run. Russian forces are engaged in heavy street fighting on the northern and eastern outskirts of the settlement. No reports says. Northern Bakhmut, the situation is not so good, so to speak. Russian forces control the junction of the M03 T0513, leading to the northern outskirts in Bakhmut and Bakhivka. In addition, Russian Russia is pushing in the area between Yahidne and Bakhivka towards Kromova to cut the supply route. Since this morning, there are reports from both sides of fighting in the easternmost parts of Bakhivka. Russian sources claim control of the high ground north of Bakhivka, but this is unconfirmed. It would complicate the defense of Bakhivka as it lies in an area 300 meters lower. So just to give you an understanding, that's that junction that the fighting he's talking about is Bakhivka here. And we'll just have a look a little bit at the topographical map. So here it is, and you have Krasnohora, you have Paraskevivka coming down here. You have this is the road, and then you have Bakhivka down in on the sort of river valley, if you like. Not that it's going to be a huge river, sort of tributaries, and then the higher ground here is controlled by the Russians just on that road. So just to let you know, that will be sort of here. And that will make it easier for them to attack Bakhivka. So Bakhivka will be difficult for the Ukrainians to keep hold of, but it is pretty important because then really Yahidne is the last place before you start being able to properly begin to encircle Bakhmut and start moving towards this main supply route coming from the west. Andrew Perpetua says north of Bakhmut, Russians broke through the Ukrainian defenses south of Paraskevivka and are fighting along the forest strips south of the M03 highway north of both Yahidne and Bakhivka. Ukrainian forces in this area seem optimistic, though. So that's an interesting piece. Claim. Now, people like Syriac Maps, for example, who are sort of pro-Russian mapper, they talk about there being quite a bit of land taken in the area. So this is their interpretation of the map. So they see Russians controlling this large area to the north of Bakhivka and coming down through just sort of north and even possibly to the west of Yahidne and interdicting a road that connects Bakhivka to Yahidne. That is a problem for the Russians. So that map isn't wholly supported by the pro-Ukrainian mappers, such as here, Poulet-Volant still has, quite an area. It doesn't even have the junction under control of the Russians there. So at the moment, it appears that, at least according to Syriac, the Russians are here and largely over here. Andrew Perpetua, likewise, has most of it being grey zone rather than Russian controlled. But Syriac Maps will have this area in Russian control and an area here, going all the way down here to these darker rectangles. So Syriac Map there, those darker rectangles, the Russians they claim are in control of. It's just I've gone with the Syriac maps here rather than the pro Ukrainian maps because I think if I present the worst case scenario, then it's kind of expectations management. If you're pro-Ukrainian, it's a sense of realism, but without being pessimistic. I think that when the Russians are doing well, I think the Russian mappers are slightly more accurate. When the Ukrainians are doing well, the Ukrainian mappers are slightly more accurate. But that's just my interpretation of what's going on there. Now, Syriac Maps then has quite a bad situation for the Ukrainians in the city eastern outskirts. So they say situation to the east of Bakhmut. So they say that the Russians continue advancing in Zabakhmutka, reaching the district cemetery and Vatutina Street, which is the higher area. About 35% of the district is now under the full control of the Russians. That is quite a substantial gain. Now, previously, we've been, hearing that the Russians have been counterattacking that area. Sorry, the Ukrainians have been counterattacking that area. But as you can see from Poulet-Volant, there's no big yellow arrow there. In fact, there's no yellow arrows anywhere. So Ukrainians had gained some area in those eastern districts, but it looks like that could well be under threat. I haven't changed. I have changed my map to reflect that. There is a bit of an overlap there. But if we go back to Syriac Maps, it's actually a little bit larger than I had previously done. So I just want to check some other sources, see whether Syriac map is correct here. But that is obviously, pretty significant for the Ukrainians there if they have lost that amount of territory in the last 24 hours, considering that was an area where they were counter-attacking previously. Um, as far as the other Ukrainian sources say, they kind of go west of the city. Then just give me 2 ticks. That Syriac maps claim is largely defended by deep state here, which, as you can see, that sort of car park area on the Syriac maps, that car park area there. Uh, deep state has under Russian control, and pretty much aligned with the Syriac maps claims. There's still a bit of holdout to the north for the Ukrainians. As you can see here, just to the south of the Art Winery. Yeah, so that's a bit of a worry. When it comes to the south and southwest and towards west, Ivanivska and this road, even Rebar's finally admitted, as they say on Telegram, southwest of Bakhmut, the enemy managed to push Russian troops back from Bakhmut Konstantinivka Road. Fighting is now taking place on the approaches to the motorway. Control over it will significantly limit the supply of the AFU garrison in Bakhmut. Yep, so that's evidently still where the Ukrainians have managed to keep the Russians at bay. But as you can see, there's no sort of yellow arrow from the from Poulet Volant. In fact, I think they've got a little bit of oh no, not regain, but there's certainly no continued pressure, it seems, from the Ukrainians, and not much else said from pro-Ukrainian sources, not apart from no reports here saying west of Bakhmut, south of Ivanivska, Ukrainian tanks are skillfully maneuvering towards Russian positions and attacking them. I think that one was from a couple of days ago, that particular bit of video footage of this tank. So I don't know whether that is fully recent, but interesting to see sort of tank battles and quite a few tanks being used in that geolocated area. So yeah, it is not just certainly for the Ukrainians, not just troops, small arms fire and small companies of troops. They are appearing to use mechanized equipment to help their counteroffensive in that area. There's not so much mechanized equipment used by the Russians in Bakhmut in general, at least, as far as when Wagner PMC were doing most of the fighting, they were basically human waves. It'd be interesting to see whether the regular Russian army uses more mechanized equipment in there as they take over, it seems, from Wagner. As we come out of Bakhmut, go down south towards Avdivka. We're just going to stop a little bit to the north of Avdivka. So here we have Avdivka, Vodyane, Opytny. We're going to look a little bit at Krasnohorivka, this Krasnohorivka, and some movement for the Russians. As you can see, I've left the blue lines there, the previous Ukrainian lines, but it looks like the Russians have moved to the west of Novoselivka Druha, crossed this road, taken some land around there, and then we've got Kamyanka down there. So they're fighting towards Kamyanka. They are trying to move to the west to get that larger encirclement of Avdivka happening. Andrew Perpetua says in the Avdivka area there's ongoing fighting near Krasnohorivka and Vesely in the north of Avdivka, on the outskirts of Avdivka itself in the south, and around Vodyane to the west. Krasnohorivka is the heaviest fighting, no changes. And indeed, Poulet Volant's map, you can see that that's where they're pressuring Krasnohorivka and Vesely from Novoselivka Druha and across the road, and you've got Kamyanka around there. So there is some pretty tough fighting around there, and just to the north of there, the Russians are trying in Novobakhmutivka as well. And as Andrew Perpetua said, there's southern areas of Avdivka here. There's quite a lot of entrenchments going on there. You can see the orange lines that Poulet Volant has on their map. And from Vodyane towards Suverny, sort of trying to overcome the trench networks that are built there. Okay, let's move a little bit further south towards Vuhledar, but we're going to stop off in Marinka first. So as we come out, we're going to pop down. There's another Krasnohorivka here, where there is fighting towards Krasnohorivka. Just to remind you, there's a place, Nevelsky, just to the south of Pervomaisky. Just around here, there's fighting around there as well. That's it, Novelsky, very small settlement with lots of entrenchments around there. So yeah, as we come down south towards Marinka, you have fighting towards Krasnohorivka, and north and south of Marinka. Haven't heard any particular details about what's going on there. As you can see from Andrew Perpetua, yep, there is heavy fighting around these places, but with no changes. And then we move on to Vuhledar. On my map, that's just down here, past Novomykhailivka, where there's the Russians are sort of building up defenses to the east of there, but there is attacks towards there for that larger encirclement of Vuhledar and these places between the watercourse and where the Russian line is. So in Vuhledar itself, no details from Tatarigami, who's a good source for Vuhledar over the last sort of 4 days, really. Andrew Perpetua says near Vuhledar, Russia is attacking the Dachas west of Mikilska. They seem to be taking significant casualties. This is a far cry from the heroic breakthrough they envisioned. And no report says in Vuhledar the Ukrainians have managed to gain a foothold in the central part of the cottages. Those are the dachas, slightly northwest of Mikilska. Yesterday, a Russian attack was repelled. This means that Ukrainian troops have completely cut off the Russians' initial line of attack and have even gained some ground. So if you remember, I don't know whether to do this on my map or this one, but if you remember, the Russians were attacking, and I need to update my map. I just want to get some confirmation. It seems like the Ukrainians have gained some ground around here, northwest of Mikilska. But if you remember, the Russians were attacking up into the heights or the higher ground of Vuhledar from Pavlivka and then from Mikilska through these are dachas there. And there are dachas there. These are sort of more rural cottage type buildings, and it seems like these are dachas as well. So 3 areas of that. Anyway, the Russians have been repelled from here, so that the fighting now seems to be around here. So if we go to the no reports. As you can see there, the Ukrainians, he's saying, have gained some land around there, pushing the Russians back behind the watercourse and back into Mikilska. And Andrew Perpetua seems to have the same sort of idea here, that the Russians have been, basically my map will look, the Russians will have their line, let's go further on here, their line will look something like that at the most. So there's quite a lot of land taken back, but this kind of ebbs and flows in that area depending on how much the Russians are just throwing at the Ukrainians along that line. But it doesn't seem like the Russians are having a particularly good time of it around Vuhledar. That is an area of Ukrainian success compared to, say, Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians really are struggling to hold off the Russians. And then not too much detail coming out for the rest of the front line, including down to Kherson. So the last thing I'll say, just a couple of interesting points at the end of the ISW report. A Russian Lancet drone manufacturer and Kalashnikov concerned subsidiary is reportedly producing drones in a public sauna following disputes over access to its facilities, prompting another Russian drone manufacturer to call for the mass assembly of drones despite the lack of availabilities of proper facilities. Ukrainian military officials reported that Russian forces are unable to repair modernized S-300 anti-aircraft missile systems near the front lines due to logistics problems and have to transfer these systems to manufacturing plants in Russia. Imagine how long it takes those vehicles out of, off battle duty and off the front line, and the amount of time it takes to take the S-300s all the way back to somewhere in Russia, repair them, and then get them back to their original position. Anyway, that's a Frontline update for today. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for supporting the channel. All the ways you can support the channel in the description below. Really do appreciate the support. And I'll be back with you for a Ukraine war update extra video a little bit later.